Get her out of here, now, Sean Jackson hissed into his earpiece, his eyes locked on the convoy of black Mercedes sedans gliding toward the Alterra Energy Tower entrance. Prince Wafid Bahar's motorcade was 3 minutes away, and the CEO of Jackson PetroWorks couldn't afford distractions, especially not a cleaner polishing glass near the billion-dollar negotiation zone. The tower's atrium stretched 40 floors above them, its walls engineered from rare desert gold marble that reflected Dubai's morning sun like liquid amber. Sean straightened his Brioni tie and forced his most confident smile, though his pulse hammered against his collar. The prince emerged from the center vehicle, his movements deliberate, assured, eyes concealed behind sleek tinted lenses. Though blind since childhood, Prince Wafid Bahar commanded more presence than most men who could see. His entourage of 6 advisors flanked him in synchronized precision, briefcases rumored to contain contracts worth $8 billion in renewable energy investment. Your Highness, just, Sean began, extending his hand with rehearsed grace. The prince responded in flowing Arabic, his tone polite yet probing, words moving faster than Sean's comprehension. The CEO's smile locked into place as panic flooded his nervous system. He fumbled for his phone, fingers trembling as he activated the AI translation app his tech team had assured him was state-of-the-art. The robotic voice that emerged garbled the prince's greeting into nonsensical fragments. Sandwells, broken contract. Your petroleum burns respect. A ripple of barely concealed laughter passed through Prince Wafid's advisors. Sean felt an empire crumbling in real time. My sincerest apologies, Your Highness, he stammered in English. But our interpreters encountered an unexpected scheduling conflict this morning. The words hung in the air like a confession of incompetence. The opulent atrium fell silent. Prince Wafid's expression hardened, his fingers tightening around the leather portfolio that represented Sean's entire legacy. Behind them, unnoticed by everyone except the prince's intuitive awareness, Maria Wilcox pushed her cleaning cart past the frozen tableau. Her gray uniform blended into the marble backdrop. Her eyes, intelligent, observant, briefly met the direction of the prince's covered gaze before looking away, her expression revealing nothing. No one in that room knew about the Georgetown Scholarship Certificate or the Beijing University Master's degree in Middle Eastern linguistics, gathering dust in her cramped Dubai apartment. No one suspected that in less than 3 hours, the woman Sean had ordered removed would become the only person capable of saving everything he'd built. 4 hours earlier, the Alterra Energy Tower had been a choreographed storm of preparation since dawn. The 50-story glass monument to oil wealth gleamed against the Arabian Gulf, its executive floors buzzing with the urgency of men who understood what billions in investment could mean. Prince Wafid Bahar arrives at precisely 11 Quag a.m., Sean announced to the emergency strategy meeting, his voice carrying the authority of 2 decades commanding boardrooms. He paced the executive conference room with military precision, his reflection multiplying in floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. His sovereign wealth fund controls over $40 billion in renewable energy portfolios worldwide, and he's evaluating whether Jackson PetroWorks is capable of transitioning from the company that drilled the past to the visionary that powers the future. Sean's knuckles whitened against the table edge. This isn't just an investment meeting. This is our transformation, or our extinction. The department heads leaned forward, absorbing every syllable. His chief financial officer outlined the contract terms that could expand their operations across 3 continents. The director of sustainability described the solar hydrogen initiatives designed specifically to align with the prince's humanitarian priorities. Security confirmed the route had been cleared, the presidential suite calibrated to exactly 21 degrees Celsius. The prince's documented preference according to his assistant's 12-page briefing document. The head of security's voice crackled through Sean's earpiece. VIP convoy entering the plaza now. Sean's pulse hammered against his collar as he positioned himself at the center of the atrium's welcome zone, flanked by his executive team. They stood like soldiers awaiting inspection. Ties straightened, smiles rehearsed, careers balanced on the edge of the next 60 seconds. The CFO shifted his weight. The director of sustainability clutched her presentation tablet so tightly her knuckles blanched. Even the head of legal, normally unshakable, kept glancing toward the entrance as if expecting divine judgment rather than a business partner. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass, Sean watched the motorcade glide to a synchronized halt. Three black Mercedes S-Class sedans positioned with military precision. The center vehicle's door opened, and Prince Wafid Bahar emerged into Dubai's morning light. The prince moved with the kind of presence that couldn't be taught or purchased. Though his eyes remained concealed behind sleek tinted lenses, protection, Sean had been briefed, for vision lost decades ago in an oil refinery explosion, his bearing suggested someone who perceived far more than most sighted men ever would. He was dressed in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit that somehow honored both Eastern tradition and Western formality, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Power, Sean realized with a cold stab of recognition, didn't need to rush. 6 advisors materialized around the prince in choreographed formation. Each carried identical leather portfolios embossed with the crest of the Bahar Royal Investment Authority, portfolios rumored to contain documentation for $8 billion in renewable energy commitments. The entourage moved as one organism, their deference to Prince Wafid, absolute yet subtle. These weren't employees. They were extensions of a man whose family had shaped Middle Eastern economics for 3 generations. Sean stepped forward, extending his hand with what he hoped projected confidence rather than desperation. Assalamu alaikum, Your Highness. Welcome to Alterra Energy Tower and to the future of Jackson PetroWorks. The prince's head tilted slightly towards Sean's voice, then past him, as if reading the dimensions of the space through sound and air pressure. When he spoke, his Arabic flowed like poetry, each syllable precisely articulated. His tone courteous, yet probing. The words came faster than Sean had anticipated, carrying nuances that his 4 weeks of basic Arabic lessons had never prepared him for. Sean's smile locked into place, but behind it, panic flooded his nervous system. He caught perhaps 3 words: mustaqbal, future; sharikat, company; and what might have been thika, trust. But the rest dissolved into linguistic chaos. His hand moved reflexively toward his jacket pocket, fingers trembling as they closed around his smartphone. "One moment, Your Highness," Sean said, his voice pitched slightly too high. He activated the AI translation app, the cutting-edge software his technology team had spent $40,000 as licensing specifically for this meeting. The screen glowed with promises of real-time multilingual interpretation and cultural context algorithms. He held the phone between them like a talisman and pressed the microphone icon. "Please, Your Highness, if you could repeat." Prince Wafid spoke again, slower this time, his expression revealing nothing. The app processed, its visualization bars dancing across the screen in neon blue. Then the robotic voice emerged from the speaker, flat and grotesquely mechanical. "Your petroleum burns the sand. Contract wells are broken. May your enterprise smoke in prosperity." The silence that followed felt geological in its weight. One of the prince's advisors, a sharp-eyed man in his 40s who Sean had been briefed was the fund's chief legal strategist, pressed his lips together, suppressing what might have been a laugh. Another advisor, a woman whose portfolio contained the environmental impact assessments, leaned toward her colleague and whispered something in Arabic that Sean couldn't decode, but whose mockery he could feel like a blade between his ribs. Prince Wafid's expression remained neutral, but something shifted in his posture, a subtle stiffening that spoke of disappointment more devastating than anger. He turned his head slightly toward his entourage, and Sean watched $8 billion in contracts begin to evaporate in real time. "Your Highness," Sean's voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Please accept my sincerest apologies. Our interpretation team encountered an unexpected, a scheduling conflict this morning, and I was assured this technology would—" The words sounded pathetic even to his own ears. Scheduling conflict, as if billion-dollar negotiations could be salvaged by blaming someone's calendar. The CFO beside him shifted, and Sean could feel the man's judgment radiating like heat. Behind them, the press photographers who'd been positioned to capture a historic handshake instead documented a CEO falling apart. Prince Wafid spoke again, his tone now distinctly cooler. the courtesy thinning into something that might have been pity. Sean caught the word afwan, pardon, or perhaps, excuse me, and recognized the linguistic structure of a farewell. The prince was preparing to leave. "Wait, your highness, please," Sean stammered, abandoning all pretense of professional composure. "I can get an interpreter here within 30 minutes, perhaps 45 if—" Sweat beaded at his temples despite the atrium's climate control. His entire executive team stood frozen, watching their leader disintegrate. The director of sustainability's hand hovered near her phone, probably already calculating how to spin this disaster to the board of directors. The head of legal stared at the marble floor as if wishing it would open beneath them all. In the periphery of the chaos, so far removed from the executive cluster that she existed in a different social dimension entirely, Maria Wilcox stood with her cleaning cart near one of the atrium's towering marble columns. Her gray uniform rendered her functionally invisible to the men in suits, but her eyes tracked every gesture, absorbed every word. She understood Prince Wafid's initial greeting with crystal clarity. "Peace be upon you, Mr. Jackson. May your enterprise prosper with the same abundance as the desert after rain. I bring hopes for a partnership built on truth." She'd heard the AI's butchering of those elegant words into nonsensical fragments about burning sand and broken wells, and she'd watched the prince's disappointment crystallize into the decision to withdraw. Maria's fingers tightened around the handle of her cleaning cart. Every instinct in her body screamed to step forward, to offer the bridge these men desperately needed, but were too blind to see standing 3 meters away. But her position was clear. Cleaners didn't interrupt billion-dollar negotiations. Cleaners didn't speak unless spoken to. Cleaners existed to make spaces pristine, not to occupy them. She caught the eye of Fatima, one of the other housekeeping staff positioned near the elevator banks. Fatima's expression mirrored Maria's own internal struggle, the agony of possessing solutions while being systematically excluded from offering them. Maria had learned Arabic during her graduate studies in cultural diplomacy. Fatima had grown up speaking it in Yemen before immigrating to Dubai. Together, they watched capable men fail at something two invisible women could have resolved in seconds. Prince Wafid gestured to his entourage, a subtle movement of his hand that nonetheless commanded absolute obedience. His advisors began repositioning themselves for departure. The chief legal strategist closed his portfolio with an audible snap that echoed through the atrium like a judge's gavel. Sean's face had gone ashen. His hand reached out, not toward the prince now, but grasping at empty air as if he could physically catch the opportunity slipping away. "Your Highness, I assure you, Jackson PetroWorks takes cultural respect with the utmost. We have the utmost regard for—" The more he spoke, the worse it became. Each word dug the hole deeper, exposing not just incompetence, but the fundamental arrogance of assuming Western business methods would suffice for global partnerships. The press cameras captured it all. The stammering CEO, the departing prince, the executives watching their careers crumble. Maria took a single step forward, then stopped. Her heart hammered against her ribcage. She thought of the Georgetown scholarship letter she'd received 9 years ago, the Beijing University certificate that represented 2 years of intensive language immersion, the dreams she'd abandoned when her mother's medical bills consumed everything. She thought of her younger siblings who depended on her income, of the choices that had led her from academic halls to marble floors. She thought of her mother's last words, "Mi hija, your gifts aren't meant to be hidden. They're meant to serve." Prince Wafid's entourage had formed a protective semicircle around him, preparing to escort him back to the motorcade. In perhaps 15 seconds, he would be gone. The deal would be dead, and Sean Jackson's empire would begin its long, slow collapse, taking with it the jobs of hundreds of people who'd never even been in this room. Maria's cartwheel squeaked as she gripped it tighter. Her breath caught. Her mind raced through 1,000 calculations of risk versus reward, fear versus purpose, invisibility versus truth. Then Prince Wafid paused. His head turned slightly, his covered eyes oriented toward the corner where Maria stood. For a moment, just a fraction of a second, his expression shifted into something that might have been curiosity, as if, despite his blindness, he'd sensed a presence in the room that others had overlooked. The question hung in the air, unspoken but palpable. Would anyone find the courage to bridge the gap? Or would pride and hierarchy doom them all? Maria's world had shrunk to the dimensions of utility closets and service corridors, spaces designed to be functional, forgettable, and small. Her hands moved on autopilot, spray bottle, microfiber cloth, circular motions across glass surfaces until they gleamed. The ammonia scent burned her nostrils the way it had for 3 years, yet she barely noticed anymore. This was her territory now, mops, disinfectant, the particular silence that came from being seen but never acknowledged. But inside her mind lived another world entirely, a universe of words that danced between languages, of diplomatic phrases that could bridge continents, of Arabic idioms her professors at Georgetown had insisted she memorize until they became second nature. Allah mal fia sik, hope lies in honesty. The phrase echoed in her memory, spoken by Professor Hamdan during her advanced Arabic seminar. She could still picture him pacing the lecture hall with passionate intensity, explaining how this simple expression contained entire philosophies of Middle Eastern negotiation. In Arab business culture, he'd said, trust is not assumed. It's earned through transparency. As-sidq isn't just truth, it's the foundation upon which all meaningful partnerships are built. Maria had written that quote in her notebook, highlighting it in yellow, never imagining that 6 years later she'd be listening to that principle being catastrophically ignored in a Dubai skyscraper. She paused near the corridor outside the executive boardroom, her cleaning cart positioned against the wall, officially invisible. Through the thick mahogany doors, she could hear Sean Jackson's voice rising in barely controlled panic. His executives scrambled, their words overlapping in chaotic desperation. But underneath it all, she caught fragments of Prince Wafid's Arabic, calm, measured, growing colder by the second. The prince said quietly, I cannot communicate with those who do not respect my language. One of Sean's assistants attempted a response, mangling the pronunciation of Na'atathir. We apologize, so badly that it came out sounding like Na'akul. We eat. Maria winced, correcting the phrase silently under her breath. She'd learned these phrases during her second year at Georgetown, when her focus had shifted from literature to diplomatic Arabic. Professor Hamdan had drilled them relentlessly, explaining that in Middle Eastern business contexts, the how of apology mattered as much as the apology itself. Maria's fingers tightened around the spray bottle. Her mother's face materialized in her memory, not as she'd been in those final hospital weeks, but earlier, vibrant, reading Maria's acceptance letter to Georgetown's Walsh School of Foreign Service. Mi hija, she'd whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. You're going to build bridges between worlds. But then the diagnosis came. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The medical bills arrived in waves, each one eroding Maria's scholarship fund, her savings, her future. She'd taken a semester's leave that became permanent when her younger siblings needed someone to pay rent, buy groceries, keep the lights on. The cleaning job at Alterra Energy Tower had been meant as temporary, just until she stabilized her family's finances. That was 3 years ago. The Beijing University summer intensive program she'd been accepted to remained an unfulfilled dream. The deposit lost. The opportunity expired. Through the boardroom door, she heard more fumbling attempts at Arabic. Someone was trying to say, investment partnership, but kept emphasizing the wrong syllables, transforming it into something that sounded vaguely like company of embarrassment. The irony cut deep. Here she stood, mere meters away, possessing precisely the skills that could salvage this disaster. She could explain the nuances Sean's team was butchering. She could translate not just words but context, the cultural expectations, the diplomatic protocols, the subtle hierarchies that made Middle Eastern business negotiations so different from their Western counterparts. But speaking up would mean revealing herself. It would mean stepping beyond the boundaries that kept her employed, crossing invisible lines that separated staff from professionals. It would mean risking the income that kept her siblings fed, the job that paid for her grandmother's medications. Maria heard footsteps approaching the boardroom doors. The meeting was ending, catastrophically, prematurely. In minutes, Prince Wafid would be gone, taking with him $8 billion and hundreds of jobs. Sean Jackson's empire would begin its collapse, and with it, her own employment security. Her hand moved to straighten her uniform. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Every rational calculation screamed at her to stay quiet, stay invisible, stay safe. But another voice whispered underneath, her mother's voice, her professor's teachings, something deeper that refused to be silenced. The boardroom doors opened. Executives began filing out, their faces etched with defeat. Through the gap, she glimpsed Prince Wafid standing preparing to leave. Sean forced himself to breathe as Prince Wafid settled into the leather chair at the head of the boardroom table, his entourage arranging themselves with choreographed precision on either side. The conference room felt simultaneously too large and suffocatingly small, 40 feet of polished mahogany stretching between them. Yet the weight of expectation compressed the air until Sean could barely draw oxygen. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Dubai's skyline glittered with the arrogance of money, a reminder of everything he stood to lose. "Perhaps we might begin with refreshments," Sean offered, gesturing toward the service cart positioned near the entrance. He'd spent $2,000 having authentic Arabic coffee prepared by a consultant who'd assured him it would demonstrate cultural awareness. The ornate brass dalla gleamed under the recessed lighting, accompanied by small, handleless cups arranged on an engraved silver tray. Marcus Chen, the 23-year-old intern from the marketing department, approached the cart with visible nervousness. Sean had selected him for this task because Marcus had attended a one-hour cultural briefing the previous week. Now, watching the young man's hands tremble as he lifted the dalla, Sean felt his first tremor of doubt. Marcus poured coffee into the first cup, filling it nearly to the brim. Already wrong, though Sean didn't yet realize it. Then, in a motion that seemed to occur in slow motion, Marcus reached out with his left hand to present the cup to Prince Wafid. The effect was instantaneous. Prince Wafid's assistant, the sharp-eyed legal strategist, who'd barely concealed his mockery earlier, went rigid. His expression shifted from professional courtesy to something colder, harder. The woman with the environmental portfolios inhaled sharply. Another advisor whispered something in Arabic that Sean couldn't understand but whose tone conveyed unmistakable disapproval. Sean's stomach dropped as cultural briefing fragments crashed through his mind too late. The left hand is considered unclean in Arab culture. Always use the right hand for giving and receiving. The dalla should be held in the left, the cup presented with the right. "Marcus," Sean started, but the damage was spreading like poison through water. Prince Wafid didn't reach for the cup. His covered eyes remained oriented toward it, but his hands stayed folded in his lap, a refusal more eloquent than words. The air thickened with offense, with the recognition that this supposedly sophisticated Western company hadn't bothered to learn the most basic elements of Middle Eastern hospitality etiquette. Then, from the periphery of the room, movement disrupted the frozen tableau. Maria Wilcox stepped forward from her position near the door, abandoning her cleaning cart with quiet decisiveness. Her gray uniform suddenly seemed less like invisibility and more like purpose stripped to its essentials. She moved with a grace that contradicted her station, crossing the expensive carpet until she stood beside the paralyzed intern. "Atasma li, Sayyidi," she said softly, her Arabic flowing with the natural cadence of someone who'd studied not just vocabulary but cultural context. "Permit me, sir." Every head in the room turned. Sean blinked, his brain struggling to process what was happening. The cleaner, the woman he'd ordered removed from the lobby, was speaking perfect Arabic in the middle of his $8 billion negotiation. Maria gently took the cup from Marcus's hand and the dalla from the cart. She positioned herself properly, the brass pot in her left hand, the small cup in her right. She poured with practiced precision, just a quarter of the cup, exactly as tradition dictated, then knelt gracefully before Prince Wafid, extending the cup with both hands in a gesture that somehow contained apology, respect, and dignity all at once. The silence that followed felt different from before, not hostile, but contemplative, charged with possibility. Prince Wafid's head tilted toward Maria's voice, his expression shifting from offense to something Sean couldn't quite read. Curiosity? Interest? The prince's right hand lifted, accepting the cup with movements that suggested he was re-evaluating everything about this meeting. "Shukran," Prince Wafid said quietly. Thank you. Then, in accented but clear English, your Arabic is educated. Where did you study? Maria remained kneeling, her eyes respectfully lowered. Georgetown University, Your Highness. Walsh School of Foreign Service. Middle Eastern Linguistics in Diplomatic Protocol. Sean's mind reeled. Georgetown? The woman who'd been polishing his floors for 3 years had studied at one of America's premier institutions for international relations? Prince Wafid raised the cup to his lips, sipped once, the ceremonial acceptance, then extended it back to Maria. She received it with both hands, completing the ritual properly. The prince's expression had softened almost imperceptibly, the rigid disapproval melting into something warmer. Prince Wafid said, "I'm finished, thank you very much," using the formal phrasing that signaled both completion and approval. Maria rose, bowed slightly, and began to fade back toward her cart. But Prince Wafid's voice stopped her. "Don't leave. Stay there, Tash." She froze, glancing uncertainly toward Sean for the first time. Her eyes met his, intelligent, questioning, suddenly visible in a way that made him realize how profoundly he'd failed to see the people maintaining his empire. Sean's carefully constructed presentation lay forgotten in his iPad. His executives stared in various states of shock and confusion. The interpreter he'd finally managed to contact stood uselessly by the wall, her services rendered obsolete by a woman in a gray housekeeping uniform. Prince Wafid turned his face toward Sean, his covered eyes somehow conveying more perception than sight ever could. When he spoke, his voice carried quiet authority. "Perhaps, Mr. Jackson, we should invite this woman to join our conversation. She appears to understand what your expensive consultants do not." The seed was planted. The blind investor had seen the unseen woman. And everything Sean thought he knew about power, value, and leadership was about to be dismantled by someone the world had taught him to overlook. Sean cleared his throat and pressed the button on his presentation remote, forcing authority into his voice that he no longer felt. "If we might proceed to the investment framework," he began, gesturing toward the massive screen behind him. The slide materialized in crisp 4K resolution. Charts, graphs, projected returns rendered in corporate blue and gold. It represented 6 months of strategic planning, countless consulting fees, the distilled expertise of his entire executive team. Prince Wafid's covered eyes remained oriented towards Sean's voice, not the screen. Of course they did. The blindness Sean had been briefed about, but somehow failed to fully internalize, now rendered his entire visual presentation worthless. 40 slides of carefully designed graphics, meaningless to the man whose approval he desperately needed. The renewable energy transition framework positions Jackson PetroWorks as a... Sean fumbled for his phone, activating the translation app again, despite its previous catastrophic failure. Perhaps if he spoke more slowly, articulated more carefully. One of the prince's advisors, the environmental specialist, leaned toward her colleague and whispered urgency in Arabic. Sean caught fragments. "This is embarrassing." Sean pressed forward, his voice rising slightly to compensate for his crumbling confidence. "Our joint venture proposal offers unprecedented access to the AI translator process joint venture, and somehow impossibly rendered it as dum mushtarak, shared guilt." The phrase hung in the air like an accusation. The chief legal strategist closed his eyes briefly, his expression suggesting he'd witnessed something painful. The woman beside him shook her head, almost imperceptibly. Across the table, the 6 advisors exchanged glances that communicated volumes Sean couldn't decode, but whose judgment pierced him like shrapnel. His CFO shifted in the adjacent chair, a subtle distancing that Sean felt in his bones. The director of sustainability stared at her tablet, perhaps already drafting resignation plans. Even his head of legal, normally unshakable, had begun studying the mahogany grain as if it contained escape routes. Sean's hands trembled beneath the table, hidden from view, but impossible to control. His fingers gripped the leather portfolio that contained backup documents, contingency strategies, fallback positions, all of them suddenly comprehensively useless. 23 years. He'd spent 23 years building Jackson PetroWorks from a regional drilling operation into an international energy conglomerate. He'd negotiated deals across 5 continents, commanded boardrooms in London and Houston and Singapore. He'd been profiled in Forbes, interviewed on Bloomberg, cited as an example of American business acumen. And now it was disintegrating because he'd underestimated three fundamental elements: culture, humility, and language. Prince Wafid spoke, his tone measured but distinctly cooler than before. Sean understood perhaps three words, none of them the critical ones. He fumbled with the phone again, but the translation that emerged, something about broken foundation contracts, bore no resemblance to what the prince had actually said. The weight of his empire pressed down on Sean's shoulders with almost physical force, $8 billion evaporating in real time. The expansion plans his board had approved, the thousands of jobs depending on this diversification into renewables. The legacy he'd imagined, transforming from the man who drilled the past to the visionary who powered the future, crumbling into cautionary tale about arrogance and preparation. Behind him, positioned near the door where Maria had been instructed to remain inconspicuous, he could sense her presence like a ghost haunting his failure. The woman with Georgetown credentials polishing his floors, the Arabic speaker he'd literally ordered removed from the lobby, the bridge between cultures that he'd been too blind, far more blind than Prince Wafid, to recognize. Maria's conscience hammered against her ribcage, drowning out the fear of unemployment. She understood what Prince Wafid was really asking about, what his advisors were whispering, what the entire negotiation hinged upon: trust. The prince wasn't interrogating Sean about profit margins or contract terms. He was testing whether Jackson PetroWorks understood that in Arab business culture, Althika, trust, preceded all transactions. Whether this American company grasped that relationships built on respect and cultural competence mattered more than PowerPoint presentations and financial projections, and they were failing catastrophically. Sean's voice had taken on a desperate edge now, words tumbling out faster as panic compressed his judgment. The sustainability metrics demonstrate our commitment to. The environmental impact assessments show our carbon neutrality timeline exceeds. But Prince Wafid had stopped listening. His posture had shifted, closing inward, his advisors beginning the subtle preparations for departure that Sean recognized with sickening certainty. The meeting was dying, the deal was dying, everything was dying. Maria took a single step forward, her cleaning uniform suddenly feeling less like camouflage and more like prison bars. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. Your gifts aren't meant to be hidden. They're meant to serve. The prince's chief legal strategist had begun closing his portfolio, the same definitive snap that had preceded their departure from the atrium earlier. In perhaps 30 seconds they would stand. The meeting would end. Sean's empire would begin its long collapse, taking with it hundreds of jobs, including her own. But more than that, more than employment, more than security, Maria couldn't watch competence defeated by incompetence when she possessed the skills to bridge the gap. She couldn't let Althika, trust, be destroyed by miscommunication when truth lived in her throat, waiting to be spoken. Her hand released the cleaning cart. Her legs moved before her mind fully decided. And Maria Wilcox, invisible for 3 years, stepped toward the center of power to speak words that would change everything. The words left Maria's throat before fear could strangle them. Excuse me. Her voice emerged softer than she intended, yet it carried through the boardroom with unexpected clarity. I believe I can assist. Every head swiveled. Sean's executives stared as if a piece of furniture had suddenly developed the capacity for speech. The CFO's mouth opened slightly, confusion and indignation warring across his features. The director of sustainability blinked, her brain struggling to process the impossibility of a cleaner interrupting a billion-dollar negotiation. Prince Wafid's covered eyes oriented toward Maria's voice with laser precision, his head tilting in that characteristic gesture of deep listening. His expression shifted from resignation to something that might have been curiosity, or perhaps recognition that something unexpected was unfolding. Sean's face flushed crimson. He rose halfway from his chair, his voice rising with barely controlled fury. This is a private meeting. We cannot have unauthorized personnel. But Maria continued, switching seamlessly into Arabic that flowed with the elegant cadence of someone who'd studied not just vocabulary, but the soul of the language itself. The prince's hand, which had been moving toward his briefcase in preparation for departure, stilled. His advisors froze mid-motion, their expressions transforming from dismissal to sharp attention. Maria took a careful breath, acutely aware of every eye boring into her, of Sean's visible fury, of the career-ending risk she was taking. But the words in her mind demanded release, truth-demanding voice regardless of consequence. She gestured respectfully toward the contract documents spread across the mahogany table. Prince Wafid leaned forward slightly, his interest palpable. One of his advisors, the chief legal strategist, immediately reached for the contract, flipping to the clause Maria had referenced. His eyes scanned the dual-language text, and his expression darkened with recognition. Sahiha, the advisor said quietly. She's correct. Sean's executives remained frozen in tableau, witnessing their meticulously prepared deal being dissected by someone they'd never imagined possessed the expertise to understand it. The irony was so sharp it could draw blood. The woman tasked with making their workspace invisible was now making their failures devastatingly visible. Maria continued, her confidence growing as Prince Wafid's posture shifted from departure to engagement. The prince's expression transformed. What had been polite withdrawal became focused intensity. He spoke directly to Maria, his Arabic formal, yet warmer than it had been throughout the entire meeting. Who are you, and how do you know this? Maria met his covered gaze with quiet dignity. My name is Maria Wilcox. I studied Middle Eastern languages and diplomacy at Georgetown University. I had hoped to work in diplomatic translation, but life chose another path. She gestured toward her gray uniform with a slight, self-deprecating smile. A ripple passed through the prince's entourage, not mockery, but something closer to respect. In Arab business culture, honesty carried more weight than status, and Maria's transparent acknowledgement of her circumstances demonstrated the side cue, truthfulness, that Prince Wafid valued above all else. The prince tilted his head thoughtfully. Wisdom does not need titles to be valuable. He turned toward Sean, whose face had cycled through fury, confusion, and was now settling into something resembling stunned comprehension. When Prince Wafid spoke, his English carried unmistakable authority. Mr. Jackson, this woman has demonstrated more cultural competence and honesty in 2 minutes than your entire team has shown in this entire meeting. Sean's mouth opened, but no words emerged. His carefully constructed executive persona had been dismantled by a woman in a cleaning uniform who possessed the one thing his expensive consultants lacked: genuine understanding. Prince Wafid's expression softened as he addressed Maria again. A voice of honesty, then in English directed at Sean but meant for everyone. Let her remain. In fact, he paused, a faint smile touching his lips. Let her lead the rest of this conversation. The power in the room shifted in a heartbeat. The executives who'd ignored Maria for 3 years now stared as she moved from the periphery to the center of the mahogany table. The cleaner became the interpreter, the strategist, the bridge between cultures that Sean's empire had desperately needed, but been too blind to recognize. Maria's hands no longer gripped a cleaning cart. They rested on the contract documents, translating not just words but context, intention, and the cultural nuances that transformed legal language into mutual understanding. And in that moment, everyone in the room understood. They were witnessing the inversion of every assumption about value, visibility, and where true leadership actually resides. The contract documents spread across the mahogany table like maps to uncharted territories, their dual language clauses creating bridges between legal systems. Maria positioned herself between the two worlds, literally and figuratively, as Prince Wafid's questions grew more probing, more complex. His Arabic carried the weight of someone testing not just linguistic comprehension, but cultural depth. The question hung in the air, far exceeding mere translation. Sean's executives shifted uncomfortably, recognizing they'd moved beyond contract specifics into ethical territory they were unprepared to navigate. Maria paused, considering not just the words but their deeper implications. In Islamic environmental philosophy, stewardship, al-wasaya, represented more than resource management. It embodied humanity's sacred responsibility as custodians of creation. Then, switching to English so Sean's team could follow, true power is not control of resources, it's the stewardship of them. The silence that followed felt profound, weighted with recognition. For the first time since the meeting began, Sean found himself listening, not as a CEO calculating profit margins, but as someone encountering concepts that challenged everything he'd assumed about energy leadership. Maria's words carried an authority that transcended hierarchy, speaking to principles his business school education had never addressed. Prince Wafid's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Aina ta'allamti hadihi al-hikmah? Where did you learn this wisdom? Something shifted in Prince Wafid's posture. When he spoke again, his voice carried a vulnerability that hadn't been present before. Ms. Wilcox, he said in English, I must tell you why these matters are personal to me. His hand moved unconsciously toward his tinted glasses. When I was 7 years old, I was visiting an oil refinery with my father. A valve failure caused an explosion. The chemical burns. He gestured toward his covered eyes. I lost most of my sight that day. Sean felt something cold settle in his stomach. The prince's distrust of Western oil companies wasn't merely philosophical. It was rooted in physical trauma. For 30 years, Prince Wafid continued, I have encountered Western energy executives who speak of acceptable risk and industry standards, while never acknowledging that their shortcuts become other people's permanent losses. Your translator app, your cultural consultants, he gestured towards Sean's presentation screen. Impressive slides. They all represent the same attitude, form without substance, appearance without understanding. Maria absorbed this revelation, understanding now why her honesty about the contract mistranslation had resonated so deeply. Prince Wafid turned back toward her voice. Then, without warning, he switched into classical Arabic poetry, his tone becoming formal. Testing, if your words are truthful, where are the proofs? And if your work is good, where are the fruits? Maria recognized the verse, a classical Arabic couplet about the relationship between intention and manifestation, between promise and delivery. She responded in kind, completing the poetic sequence. The proofs are in actions, not in words, and the fruits are in service, not in position. Prince Wafid's advisors exchanged glances of impressed recognition. Classical Arabic poetry wasn't simply language. It was cultural currency, demonstrating deep immersion in Middle Eastern intellectual tradition. Mumtaz, Prince Wafid said quietly, excellent, then switching back to English and directing his words toward Sean. Mr. Jackson, I have a proposal. For the remainder of this negotiation, I request that Ms. Wilcox serve as our official interpreter. Not your technology, not your consultants, her. Sean's mouth opened, but Prince Wafid continued. She understands what your expensive advisors clearly do not, that successful international partnerships require more than legal frameworks. They require thika, trust, and trust begins with honest communication. The prince's chief legal strategist nodded agreement. Your Highness, I believe this would ensure accuracy in ways we haven't experienced yet today. Maria felt the weight of $8 billion settling on her shoulders. The cleaning cart by the door seemed to belong to another lifetime. Her gray uniform had become academic robes. Her invisibility transformed into indispensable visibility. Sean stared at the woman who'd polished his floors for 3 years, now positioned as the crucial bridge to the most important deal in his company's history. Everything he'd thought he understood about value, expertise, and where true leadership resided was being systematically dismantled. And for the first time in decades, Sean Jackson found himself in the position he'd assigned to everyone else, waiting to learn from someone he'd never bothered to see. The signing ceremony unfolded like a perfectly choreographed performance. Sean positioned himself beside Prince Wafid at the mahogany table, cameras positioned strategically to capture the historic moment. The revised contracts, now meticulously translated by Maria, every clause verified against cultural context and legal precision, awaited signatures that would transform Jackson PetroWorks from a fossil fuel giant into a renewable energy innovator. Flashbulbs erupted as pens touched paper. The CFO exchanged relieved glances with the Director of Sustainability. Public relations staff quietly celebrated what would become tomorrow's headlines. Jackson PetroWorks secures $8 billion investment from Gulf Sovereign Fund. Sean allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The deal was done. His legacy secured. The crisis averted by... He glanced toward Maria, still positioned near the table in her gray uniform, someone he'd almost had removed from the building. Prince Wafid set down his pen with deliberate care, then turned his face toward Sean with an expression that suggested the business portion had concluded, but something else remained unsaid. "Mr. Jackson," the prince said quietly, his voice cutting through the celebratory murmurs with unexpected gravity. The room instinctively hushed. "Tell me something." Prince Wafid's covered eyes oriented toward Sean with that unsettling perception that seemed to bypass mere sight. "How many others like her?" He gestured toward Maria. "Work unseen in your towers." The question landed like a physical blow. Sean's mouth opened, but no words emerged. Around him, his executives suddenly found their polished Italian shoes fascinating. The CFO studied his Rolex. The director of sustainability became absorbed in closing her portfolio. Even the head of legal, normally unflappable, looked as if he wished he could dissolve into the mahogany grain. The cameras continued flashing, but their light now felt accusatory rather than celebratory. Sean looked at Maria, really looked at her for perhaps the first time. She stood with quiet dignity, her gray uniform no longer rendering her invisible, but instead highlighting the profound disconnect between competence and recognition. Her expression held no triumph, no vindication, only the patient endurance of someone who'd learned to carry brilliance in silence. The empire Sean had built, 50 stories of engineered glass and desert gold marble, operations spanning 5 continents, drilling platforms and refineries, and now solar installations. All of it suddenly revealed itself as standing on invisible shoulders. How many janitors held engineering degrees from universities that couldn't afford to keep them enrolled? How many maintenance workers spoke 3 languages but cleaned toilets because immigration status prevented professional employment? How many security guards possessed expertise that far exceeded their uniform's implied limitations? Sean had spent 23 years measuring success in stock prices and quarterly earnings, never once considering that his empire's true foundation might be people like Maria, overqualified, undervalued, systematically overlooked. Prince Wafid's question echoed in the silence, louder than any applause, more devastating than any business critique. "Your Highness," Sean began, his voice rough with recognition he couldn't quite articulate. I... He swallowed hard, a mouth. "I don't know. I honestly don't know." The admission cost him something. Pride, certainly, but also the comfortable illusion that he'd built his success purely through vision and determination, rather than on the backs of people he'd never bothered to see. Prince Wafid nodded slowly, as if Sean's honesty was itself a small redemption. "Perhaps," the prince said, "that is something worth discovering." The press conference that followed felt surreal. Sean stood at the podium, delivering carefully prepared remarks about partnership and innovation in sustainable futures. But halfway through, he departed from the script. "Before we conclude," Sean heard himself saying, "I want to publicly acknowledge Maria Wilcox, whose expertise in Arabic language and Middle Eastern cultural diplomacy proved instrumental in today's successful negotiations." He gestured toward her, and she stepped forward reluctantly into the camera lights. The journalist scribbled notes, intrigued by this unexpected narrative twist. Sean continued, "Ms. Wilcox has been part of the Jackson PetroWorks family for 3 years, and I deeply regret that it took a crisis for us to recognize the extraordinary talents she brings to our organization." It was perhaps the most honest statement he'd made all day, though privately Sean knew it barely scratched the surface of his failure. That evening, alone in his executive suite overlooking Dubai's glittering skyline, Sean replayed Prince Wafid's question until it echoed louder than the champagne toasts, more insistent than the congratulatory phone calls from board members. How many others like her work unseen in your towers? The contracts were signed, the investment secured, his company's future guaranteed. But the prince's lesson transcended financial success. It had become moral education delivered by someone whose blindness saw more clearly than Sean's supposedly perfect vision ever had. Sean stared at his reflection in the glass. A man who'd conquered industries but missed entirely the human beings maintaining his empire. The revelation didn't arrive as dramatic epiphany, but as slow, uncomfortable recognition. True leadership wasn't about commanding from heights. It was about seeing those working in shadows. He thought of Maria returning to her cramped apartment, her Georgetown diploma gathering dust, her brilliance systematically wasted, because people like him had looked through her rather than at her for 3 years. The $8 billion deal suddenly felt less like victory and more like reckoning, an expensive lesson in what happens when power stops questioning its own assumptions. Sean opened his laptop and began typing an email, then deleted it. Some conversations required presence, not digital distance. Tomorrow he would begin asking questions his arrogance had prevented him from considering. Who are you? What do you know? What have we been too blind to see? The empire he'd built still stood, but the man who'd constructed it was beginning to crumble, humbled not by failure, but by the far more devastating revelation of how much he'd missed while believing he saw everything. 1 month later, Dubai's skyline burned gold against the Arabian Gulf, the morning sun transforming glass towers into monuments of light and ambition. Maria Wilcox walked through the Alterra Energy Tower's atrium, the same marble expanse where she'd once pushed cleaning carts and polished fingerprints from glass doors. But today, her footsteps echoed differently, carrying the authority of someone who'd moved from invisibility to indispensability. She wore a tailored navy suit, its fabric woven with subtle threads that caught the light as she moved. Embroidered discreetly above the breast pocket were words that still felt surreal. Director of Cultural Engagement, though the same glass doors she'd cleaned now reflected a different woman, not transformed, but finally seen. Sean Jackson stood at the podium positioned near the atrium's center, flanked by executives and staff members whose faces represented the full spectrum of the company's hierarchy. Engineers in pressed shirts, janitors in work uniforms, receptionists who'd greeted visitors for years while their own stories remained unasked, security personnel whose night shifts kept the empire running while executives slept. The CEO's expression carried a humility that hadn't existed 6 weeks ago, the kind of transformation that comes not from failure, but from recognizing how much you'd missed while believing you saw everything. Today marks the launch of an initiative that will fundamentally change how Jackson PetroWorks operates, Sean began, his voice carrying through the atrium with quiet conviction. The Bridge program is designed to discover and develop hidden talents within our organization, to ensure that we never again overlook brilliance simply because we've assigned someone a uniform instead of a corner office. Applause rippled through the gathered employees, but Maria noticed the skeptical expressions among some of the cleaning staff, the maintenance workers who'd learned not to trust sudden corporate enthusiasm. Sean gestured toward Maria. I'm honored to introduce the architect and leader of this program, Director Maria Wilcox, whose courage in stepping forward during critical negotiations reminded us all that greatness doesn't announce itself with credentials. It whispers in unexpected voices, waiting for someone humble enough to listen. Maria approached the podium, acutely aware of eyes tracking her movement. She saw Fatima, her colleague from housekeeping, standing near the back with cautious hope. She recognized Ahmed, the night security guard who spoke 4 languages but had never been asked about anything beyond visitor logs. She spotted Rosa, the cafeteria manager who'd once mentioned studying architecture before life redirected her path. Thank you, Mr. Jackson, Maria began, her voice steady but warm. But I want to be clear about something from the beginning. She paused, making eye contact with the employees in gray uniforms, blue coveralls, service vests, the people who maintain the empire's foundation while remaining systematically invisible. Greatness doesn't wear a title, it carries service, Maria said quietly. I was seen not because I stood out, but because someone finally listened. And that's what the Bridge program is really about. Listening to voices we've been trained to ignore, recognizing expertise we've learned to overlook, honoring the truth that competence exists everywhere, regardless of job descriptions. She gestured toward the portraits on the atrium's wall, photographs of the company's leadership throughout its history, and now, newly added, a formal portrait of Prince Wafid Bahar taken during the contract signing. Prince Wafid told me something before he left Dubai, Maria continued, her eyes drawn to the photograph. He said, your sight restored my faith in humanity. Not because I'm extraordinary, But because I represented something he'd stopped believing Western corporations valued, honesty over hierarchy, substance over status, side Q, truthfulness as the foundation of everything meaningful. She turned back to the assembled employees, particularly addressing those who'd shared her invisibility. The Bridge program will provide skill assessments, educational support, mentorship in pathways to positions that match your actual capabilities rather than your current job titles, Maria explained. If you're a janitor with an engineering degree, we want to know. If you're a receptionist fluent in languages we need for international operations, we want to hear from you. If you're security personnel with technology expertise, financial acumen, creative skills, whatever brilliance you've been carrying in silence, this program exists to bring it into the light. Murmurs of interest spread through the crowd. Fatima's expression shifted from skepticism to possibility. Ahmed straightened slightly, as if reconsidering his own potential. Rosa pulled out her phone, probably already composing questions about the architectural design division. But here's what I need you to understand, Maria said, her tone becoming more intimate. This program isn't charity, it's correction. For too long, this company, like most companies, has operated on the assumption that job titles reflect capability, that uniforms indicate limitations, that hierarchy equals competence. Prince Wafid's question to Mr. Jackson was simple but devastating. How many others like her work unseen in your towers? She let the question hang in the air, watching recognition dawn across faces. The answer should have been zero, Maria said. In a just system, no one's talents go wasted. No one's education gets buried beneath job descriptions that fail to see them. No one spends years polishing floors when they could be building bridges between cultures, or designing sustainable architecture, or solving technical problems that the people in corner offices haven't even recognized yet. After the launch ceremony, as employees dispersed with application forms and renewed possibilities, Maria stood alone near the floor-to-ceiling glass that overlooked Dubai's perpetual construction, cranes lifting steel, workers building tomorrow's monuments. She pressed her palm against the glass she'd once cleaned compulsively, ensuring every reflection remained perfect for people who'd never noticed her reflection among them. Now her own image merged with the city skyline, no longer invisible, but integrated into the landscape of power and possibility she'd only observed from service corridors. Sometimes light only finds you, Maria whispered to her reflection, to the morning sun transforming glass into gold, to the memory of her mother who'd believed in bridges between worlds. After you've cleaned the glass for everyone else. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent 3 years making surfaces transparent so others could see through them, never imagining that one day someone would finally see her. Not despite her position, but because truth couldn't stay invisible forever, even when dressed in gray uniforms and assigned to corners. Behind her, the Alterra Energy Tower hummed with renewed purpose. Employees who'd worked in shadows were stepping toward light. Talents long buried were being excavated. And an empire that had stood on invisible shoulders was finally learning to see the people who'd been holding it up all along. Maria smiled faintly at her reflection, then turned toward her new office, no longer cleaning others' spaces, but creating space for others to be seen. The glass remained spotless, but now it reflected something true. If this story moved you, share the moment. Don't let it fade. Follow Motherland Stories and tap that like button to keep these voices alive. Every day we uncover strong stories, raw truths, and quiet acts of courage that shape our world. Join a circle of listeners, dreamers, and changemakers, because every story deserves to be heard. This wasn't just an episode, it was a call to remember. Silence hides injustice. Courage exposes it. At Motherland Stories, we don't turn away. We bear witness. Subscribe and stand with stories that challenge power and celebrate truth.